It was supposed to be a simple transaction. A single night, a borrowed dress, and a few forced smiles at the high table. He needed a shield against his council's political matchmaking. I needed my tavern's back taxes forgiven. We shook on it. No strings. No feelings. Just one fake date with the Alpha King. But we underestimated the pack. Wolves don't just see a bond, they smell it. And whatever they caught scent of that night, they decided was entirely dangerously real. The floorboards of the Boar's Head Tavern were permanently sticky. No amount of lye or boiling water could lift the decades of spilled ale rendered fat and crushed rushes. Maeve didn't mind. The stickiness was familiar. It meant business was steady, which meant she could afford the exorbitant winter tithes the crown demanded. She wiped a rag across the scarred oak of the bar, her knuckles white. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow, crooked streets of Oak Hill. It was a miserable Tuesday in late November. The hearth fire sputtered, fighting a losing battle against the draft coming through the warped shutters. The heavy iron-bound door slammed open. Wind rushed in, carrying the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and wet dog. Actually, wet wolf. The tavern went dead silent. 3 farmers in the corner stopped arguing over their dice. The barmaid Beatrice froze with a pitcher of mead halfway to a table. King Cailan stood in the doorway. He didn't look like the ballads claimed. There was no gleaming armor, no crown of iron and bone. He wore a heavy leather tunic, stained dark with rain, and a thick fur mantle that looked like it had seen better days. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night in a decade. Maeve didn't bow. She just wrung out her rag in the wooden bucket beneath the counter. "Sire," she said, her voice flat. "If you're here to collect the tax early, you're out of luck. The ledger is open, the coin box is light." Cailan stepped inside and pushed the door shut behind him. The heavy thud seemed to restart the room. The farmers hastily went back to their dice, whispering frantically. "I'm not here for your coin, Maeve," Cailan said. His voice was gravel rough and low. He walked to the bar and sat on a stool that groaned under his weight. He smelled of rain-soaked pine and cold iron. "Then what?" She poured him a mug of bitter ale without asking. It was what he always drank when he slummed it in the lower ward, pretending he was just a regular patron and not the apex predator of the entire Northern Territory. Cailan stared at the foam settling in the mug. He didn't touch it. "The solstice feast is Friday. I'm aware. I've been roasting pigs for 3 days. My hair smells like pork fat. I'm practically a walking sausage." A muscle in his jaw twitched. It might have been a suppressed smile, but Maeve wouldn't bet on it. "Lord Reginald is bringing his daughter Clara. So is Lord Cedric. They intend to box me into a corner. The council is threatening to withhold their border patrols unless I choose a mate by the end of the feast." Maeve leaned her elbows on the sticky bar. "Sounds like a you problem, Your Grace. Pick one. Clara has nice teeth. Cedric's girl is a bit cross-eyed, but she owns half the western grazing lands. I don't want a political leash around my neck." Cailan said, his eyes snapping up to meet hers. They were a dull, stormy grey. Not glowing, not feral. Just tired. "If I mate into one of those families, I alienate the other. Civil war by spring. I need a third option. Someone neutral. Someone with no political backing, no ulterior motives, and absolutely no interest in me." Maeve blinked. She looked at the dirty rag in her hand, then back to the King of the North. "You want to borrow my pig boy? Toby's a bit young, but he's very neutral. I want you, Maeve." She laughed. It was a short, harsh sound. "Absolutely not. One night," Cailan said, leaning forward. The wood creaked. "You attend the feast with me. You sit at my right hand. We act as if we are courting. It stalls the council, it insults neither Reginald nor Cedric, and it buys me until the spring thaw to solidify my own alliances. I am unawakened," Maeve said, dropping her voice. "I have no wolf. I don't shift. The lords look at me and see a glorified human. They'll tear your throat out for insulting them." "They will be confused," Cailan corrected. "Confusion breeds hesitation. Hesitation gives me time." Maeve shook her head. turning away to stack pewter cups. "No, I run a tavern. I don't play politics. The moment the feast is over, those lords will remember I'm just a peasant who made them look foolish. I like my head attached to my neck. I will waive your taxes for the next 5 years." Kaelin said quietly. Maeve froze. The pewter cup in her hand hovered an inch above the stack. 5 years. That wasn't just survival. That was a new roof. That was replacing the rotted floorboards. That was paying Beatrice a proper wage. She turned back to him. She scrutinized his face, looking for the trap. "A full pardon on all back taxes documented and sealed by the Royal Exchequer." "Done," Kaelin said without hesitation. "And absolute protection from Reginald and Cedric's retaliation. Your personal guard watches this tavern for 6 months. 1 year, Kaelin countered. "I'll post 2 men at your door." Maeve exhaled slowly. She hated this. She hated the way his presence made the air in the tavern feel thin. But she looked at the sagging ceiling beams blackened by soot and time. "One night," Maeve said, pointing a damp finger at him. "We show up, we eat, you pretend to be smitten, I pretend I don't want to stab you with a dinner fork, and then I go home. No lingering touches, no dramatic kissing, strictly business." Kaelin agreed. He finally picked up the mug of ale and took a long drink. "I'll have a dress sent down tomorrow. Something that doesn't smell like pork fat." "Don't push your luck, Your Grace." The dress didn't smell like pork fat. It smelled like cedarwood and expensive oils. It was a deep, muted blue made of heavy velvet that kept out the winter draft of the castle corridors. It wasn't overly ornate, no jewels, no ridiculous trains, but it fit perfectly. Kaelin's tailors were terrifyingly efficient. Maeve stood in the antechamber outside the great hall, her stomach twisting into uncomfortable knots. She felt entirely out of place. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing pots and chopping firewood, stood out against the smooth velvet. Kaelin stepped out from a side corridor. He wore formal attire tonight, a high-collared tunic of charcoal wool, silver clasps at his shoulder, and a heavy cloak edged in black fur. He looked sharper, harder than he had in her tavern. He looked like a king. He stopped in front of her, his eyes doing a quick pragmatic sweep from her head to her boots. "You clean up well." "I bathed," Maeve said dryly. "Don't get used to it." He offered his arm. "Ready?" "No, let's get this over with." She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. The muscle beneath the wool was rigid. He was tense. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the noise hit Maeve like a physical blow. The great hall was packed. Hundreds of wolves dressed in their finest furs and leathers crowded the long tables. The heat generated by so many shifting bodies was stifling. Fire roared in 3 massive hearths illuminating the stone walls. The smell was overwhelming. Roasted venison-spiced wine pine boughs, and the sharp, musk-heavy scent of predatory anticipation. The herald banged his staff on the stone floor. "King Kaelin and his guest." The noise died instantly. Every head turned. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, some brown, some green, some flashing gold in the firelight, locked onto Maeve. The silence was heavy, thick with confusion and rising indignation. Kaelin didn't falter. He stepped forward, pulling Maeve along with him. His pace was measured slow, entirely unbothered. Maeve forced herself to look straight ahead, keeping her chin level. She felt like a sheep walking into a den of very well-dressed slaughterers. They reached the high table. Lord Reginald sat to the left, his daughter Clara beside him. Clara was beautiful, with thick auburn hair and an aggressive sneer. Lord Cedric was on the right. Both lords looked at Maeve as if she were a piece of dirt someone had tracked onto a rug. Kaelin pulled out Maeve's chair. It was an incredibly domestic gesture, rare for an alpha. A low murmur rippled through the hall. Maeve sat. Kaelin took his place beside her. The feast began, but the tension never broke. "He's playing a game," Lord Reginald muttered to Cedric, just loud enough for Maeve to hear over the clatter of plates. "Bringing a commoner, an unawakened. Ignore them," Kaelin murmured, leaning close to Maeve. His breath brushed her ear, warm and smelling of wine. Maeve stiffened. The proximity was part of the deal, but it felt entirely unnatural. It's hard to ignore people who are actively plotting my murder over the salt cellar. She whispered back, keeping her face perfectly impassive. Kalen reached under the table and rested his hand over hers. His palm was calloused, his fingers heavy. The heat of his skin bled through the thin velvet of her dress. Maeve nearly flinched, but she held entirely still. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Just eat. Let them look." Across the table, Clara narrowed her eyes. "Tell me, Maeve," she said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "What pack do you hail from? I don't recognize your scent. In fact, I barely smell anything at all." It was a direct insult, a reminder that Maeve lacked a wolf. Maeve picked up her goblet, stalling for a second. She took a sip of water. "I run the Boar's Head down in the lower ward, Lady Clara. As for my scent, it's mostly cheap ale and hard work. I highly recommend trying the latter sometime." A few minor lords down the table choked on their wine. Clara flushed red, her lips pulling back slightly to reveal the tips of lengthened canines. Reginald slammed his hand on the table. "You allow this disrespect, Kalen." Reginald barked. Kalen didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply shifted his gaze to Reginald. "Maeve speaks her mind. It is one of the many things I admire about her. If you find her honesty disrespectful, Reginald, perhaps you should reflect on the question your daughter asked." He lifted his hand from beneath the table and rested it on the back of Maeve's chair, his fingers idly brushing the nape of her neck. It was a possessive gesture, a clear warning. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. The brush of his fingers sent a weird jolt down her spine. It was a performance. She knew it was a performance. But Kalen's eyes were dark, and the way he looked at her in front of the entire court made her breath catch. The rest of the night passed in a blur of calculated touches. Kalen passing her a platter of meat. Kalen leaning in to laugh at a joke she hadn't made. The court watched every interaction, dissecting it. By the time the final course was cleared, the lords weren't looking at Maeve with disgust anymore. They were looking at her with wariness. When it was over, Kalen walked her back to the antechamber. The heavy doors closed behind them, muffling the noise of the hall. Maeve immediately stepped away from him, creating space. She rubbed her arms, suddenly cold, despite the heavy dress. "We survived," Kalen said, leaning against the stone wall. He looked drained. "You owe me a roof." Maeve said, her voice a little shakier than she intended. He offered a brief, exhausted nod. "The Exchequer will have the papers tomorrow. Thank you, Maeve. It worked." She unclasped the heavy velvet cloak he had lent her and handed it back. "Good. I'm going back to my tavern. Have a good life, Kalen." She walked away down the dark corridor, eager to get out of the suffocating castle. It was done. It was over, or so she thought. Maeve woke up to the sound of rain hammering against the slate shingles of her small room above the tavern. Her head ached slightly, a residual hangover from the stress of the previous night. She dragged herself out of bed, threw on her usual rough-spun tunic and apron, and went downstairs to open the shop. The world felt normal. The tavern smelled of stale ale. The floor was still sticky. She grabbed her basket and a worn cloak. She needed fresh bread from the baker 2 streets over. The morning market was a muddy, chaotic mess. Wagons trundled through the muck, merchants yelled their prices, and stray dogs fought over scraps. Maeve navigated the chaos with practiced ease, stepping over puddles and dodging wandering sheep. She reached the baker's stall. Old Man Arthur was pulling a fresh batch of sourdough from his brick oven. "Morning, Arthur," Maeve said, fishing 2 copper coins from her pocket. "2 loaves, please." Arthur turned. He saw her, and he froze. The wooden peel in his hand clattered to the cobblestones. Slowly, deliberately, the old baker wiped his flour-dusted hands on his apron and bowed. It wasn't a casual nod. It was a deep, waist-bending bow, reserved for nobility. Maeve stared at him. "Arthur, did you hit your head on the oven door?" "My lady!" Arthur mumbled, keeping his eyes on the mud. 2 loaves. Yes, take them. No charge." He grabbed the bread, wrapped it hastily in a clean cloth, and shoved it into a basket. "Arthur, take the coin," Maeve said, trying to press the copper into his hand. He recoiled as if she were holding hot coals. "I couldn't, not from the king's chosen. Please, my lady." Maeve frowned. "Arthur, stop calling me that. I'm Maeve. I bought 3 stale pies from you on Tuesday." But Arthur was already backing away, refusing to make eye contact. Thoroughly unsettled, Maeve walked back towards the tavern. As she moved through the market, she noticed it happening everywhere. Conversation stopped as she passed. A group of rowdy mercenaries stepped aside to give her a wide berth, dipping their heads. Even the city guards, who usually leered or ignored her, entirely snapped to attention and struck their chests in salute when she walked by. It was terrifying. She practically ran the last block, throwing open the door to the Boar's Head and locking it behind her. Beatrice was sweeping the hearth. Maeve gasped, dropping the basket on a table. "People are acting crazy. The baker wouldn't take my money. The guard saluted me." Beatrice stopped sweeping. She leaned on her broom and gave Maeve a long, hard look. "Well, what did you expect? The whole town is talking." "Talking about what?" "About you. And the king." Beatrice walked over, her voice dropping to a loud whisper. "They're saying he found his mate. They're saying the way he looked at you last night. The way you smelled." "I smelled like nothing," Maeve argued. "I'm unawakened." "That's just it," Beatrice said, eyes wide. "They think your wolf is dormant. They think the king's proximity is pulling it out of you. The guards at the castle told the blacksmith who told his wife who told me. They said the king's scent was all over you. They said it was a true mating bond." Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. No, it was a business arrangement, to piss off Reginald. "Tell that to the pack," Beatrice said, shaking her head. "Wolves don't fake scents, Maeve. You might have been acting, but to them it was as real as the moon." A heavy knock rattled the front door. Maeve jumped. "Open up," a familiar, gravelly voice demanded. Maeve unlocked the door. Kaelan stood on the threshold. He didn't look like an exhausted king today. He looked like a cornered animal. 2 heavily armed royal guards flanked him. They immediately bowed to Maeve, their eyes deferential. Kaelan waved them off. "Wait outside." He stepped in and shut the door. "What did you do?" Maeve hissed, backing away from him. "I walked to the market and people are treating me like I'm made of glass. What is going on?" Kaelan dragged a hand through his damp hair. He paced the length of the tavern floor, his boots loud against the wood. "We have a problem. A problem. The deal is done, Kaelan. The taxes—" "Forget the taxes?" He snapped, turning to face her. "Reginald isn't backing down. He thinks we're bluffing." "We are bluffing. I know that." Kaelan shouted, his voice echoing in the empty tavern. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and forced his tone back to a steady rumble. "I know. But Reginald filed a formal petition this morning. He challenged the legitimacy of the bond. Under pack law, if a king claims a mate from outside the noble lines, the bond must be proven." Maeve felt her stomach drop to the sticky floorboards. "Proven how?" "By courting. Publicly. Under the observation of the elders." Kaelan said grimly, "For the next 3 months." "No," Maeve said immediately, shaking her head. "No way. I agreed to 1 night. 1, not 3 months of playing house with a man with a target on his back. If we stop now, if I admit it was a ruse, Reginald will demand I step down for deceiving the pack. Cedric will back him. It will be war. They will burn this city to the ground, Maeve, starting with this tavern." Maeve stared at him. The reality of the situation crashed over her like a freezing wave. She hadn't just agreed to a fake date. She had unwittingly stepped onto a chessboard where she was the most vulnerable piece. "You trapped me," she whispered. Kaelan stepped closer. The scent of pine and iron washed over her again, stronger this time. "I didn't mean to. I thought the feast would be enough. But the pack, they believe it. They caught a scent on us last night." "I don't have a scent. I don't know how to explain it," Kaelan said, his eyes searching hers, looking lost for the first time. "But when I touched you, my wolf reacted. The court smelled my reaction. They smelled possessiveness. Now they think you belong to me. Maeve crossed her arms over her chest, trying to hold herself together. So what happens now? Kalen reached into his cloak and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. It clinked solidly as he placed it on the bar. I pay off your debts. I post guards at your door. And tomorrow I take you to the market. We hold hands. We talk. We let the elders see us. And if I refuse, you can't, Kalen said softly. Because if you walk away now, Reginald will realize I lied. And he will kill you just to make a point. Maeve looked at the coin purse. Then she looked at the Alpha King standing in her dingy tavern, having completely ruined her simple, quiet life. Fine, Maeve said bitterly. 3 months, but you're buying me better shoes. The new boots were thick leather lined with sheepskin and entirely too heavy. Maeve clomped through the cobblestone streets of the upper ward, feeling less like a prospective queen and more like a draft horse hauling a loaded cart. Beside her, King Kalen moved with silent, infuriating grace. You're dragging your feet, he murmured, his gaze fixed straight ahead. I'm wearing anvils. Maeve muttered back, keeping a rigid smile on her face. If a pack of rogue wolves attacks us right now, my survival strategy is to sink to the bottom of the nearest river. Kalen's hand tightened around hers. It was part of the act. The elders were watching. Maeve couldn't see them, but she could feel them. The market square of the upper ward was ostensibly a place for commerce, but today it felt like a theatre stage. Merchants selling salted fish and winter roots suddenly seemed intensely interested in rearranging their displays whenever Kalen and Maeve walked past. 3 o'clock, by the cooper's stall. Kalen said, his voice barely a rumble in his chest. Elder Garrick. Maeve subtly shifted her eyes. An old man with a face like weathered granite stood near a stack of oak barrels. He wasn't browsing. He was staring directly at their intertwined hands, his nostrils flaring slightly, taking in the scent of the air around them. Smile at me, Kalen ordered softly. I am smiling. My face hurts. A real smile, Maeve. Look at me like I just forgave your tavern taxes for the next 5 years. Maeve snapped her head toward him, an insult ready on her tongue, but the words died in her throat. Kalen was looking down at her, and the exhaustion that usually shadowed his grey eyes was gone. In its place was a sharp, focused intensity. The cold winter air had brought a flush to his cheeks, and the wind tossed his dark hair across his forehead. He looked startlingly handsome. It caught her off guard, a sudden jarring reminder that he wasn't just a political headache, he was a man. She let out a short, genuine laugh, shaking her head. You are an arrogant bastard, you know that. It's a prerequisite for the crown. Kalen replied, the corner of his mouth ticking upward. It was a microscopic shift, but it changed his entire face. The heavy oppressive aura of the Alpha King fractured, revealing something dangerously human underneath. He lifted his free hand and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. His knuckles brushed against her cold cheek. The touch was light, but it felt like a spark of static electricity. Maeve's breath hitched. She saw his pupils dilate the dark grey, bleeding into the whites of his eyes. He's acting, she reminded herself fiercely. It's for Garrick. But the air between them felt suddenly thick. The ambient noise of the market, the shouting fishmongers, the rattling cartwheels, the barking dogs seemed to drop away. Your heart is beating fast, Kalen murmured, his hand dropping back to his side. I'm out of shape. Maeve lied, looking away. She focused aggressively on a stall selling dried apples. Buy me something. Garrick expects you to woo me. Woo me with dried fruit. Kalen steered her toward the stall. He didn't buy the apples. He bought a small, intricately carved wooden comb from the merchant next door, dropping a silver coin onto the table without asking the price. When he pressed the comb into Maeve's hand, his fingers lingered on hers a second too long. They walked the perimeter of the market twice more before Kalen finally steered them toward the castle gates. The moment the heavy iron portcullis closed behind them, cutting them off from the public eye, Maeve dropped his hand. She stepped away, rubbing her palms against her heavy wool coat. Did it work? She asked, her voice sounding a little too loud in the stone courtyard. Kalen didn't answer immediately. He was staring at his own hand, the one that had been holding hers, with a deeply unsettled expression. He flexed his fingers, then looked up at her. "Garrick will report that we are courting." Kylan said, his voice flat. He walked past her, heading for the keep. "But he isn't the one we have to worry about." Maeve hurried to keep up with his long strides. "Who then?" Reginald Kylan threw over his shoulder. "He requested an audience with the High Council this afternoon. He wants a trial of the hearth." Maeve stopped walking. The heavy boots felt even heavier. She had grown up on the fringes of pack territory. She knew the old laws, the ones usually reserved for historical ballads and drunken tavern arguments. The hearth trial. She echoed, her voice hollow. "You're joking. That's for Luna candidates, to prove they can provide for the pack." Kylan stopped and turned back to her. The courtyard shadows clung to his heavy fur cloak. "Reginald argued that since you lack a wolf, you must prove your physical worth to the pack in other ways." The council agreed. "Kylan, I pour ale and yell at drunks for a living. I can't drag a bloody elk out of the frozen woods." "I know," Kylan said, stepping closer. The raw frustration in his eyes mirrored her own panic. "I fought them on it. I told them it was archaic. But Cedric backed Reginald. If I refuse the trial on your behalf, it proves to them that you are unfit, and our bond is dissolved by pack law." Maeve looked up at the looming stone towers of the keep, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. She was a human in a world of monsters playing a game she didn't know the rules to. "When is it?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow at dawn." Kylan reached out his hand, hovering over her shoulder, before he pulled it back, clenching it into a fist at his side. "Maeve, I will give you whatever you need. Weapons, traps, maps of the hunting grounds." "Can you give me a wolf?" she asked bitterly. Kylan swallowed hard. "No. Then I guess I'll just have to use my brain," Maeve said, turning her back on him and marching toward the warmth of the kitchens. "Send me those maps, Your Grace, and a very sharp knife." The Blackwood Ridge was a cruel place in December. The pines grew so thick they choked out the morning sun, leaving the forest floor trapped in a permanent icy twilight. Snow crunched loudly under Maeve's boots. The wind sliced through her thick cloak, biting at her exposed nose and cheeks. She stood at the edge of the tree line. 50 yards behind her, a viewing pavilion had been erected. Kylan sat in the center seat, flanked by Reginald Cedric and half a dozen pack elders. Kylan was perfectly still, his posture rigid. He hadn't looked at her since she stepped into the snow. If he showed fear for her, Reginald won. The rules of the hearth trial were simple, brutal, and entirely stacked against her. She had until sundown to enter the ridge and return with a kill large enough to feed the High Council. No magic, no outside help. If she failed, she was deemed unworthy to stand beside the Alpha. Maeve adjusted the heavy leather belt at her waist. Hanging from it was a skinning knife, a coil of thin wire, and a small pouch of strong-smelling herbs she used to keep rats out of the tavern cellar. She carried a short, iron-tipped hunting spear in her right hand. A horn blew. The sound echoed off the mountains, mournful and sharp. The trial had begun. Maeve didn't run. Running wasted energy and made noise. She walked deliberately into the tree line, letting the shadows swallow her. She knew the wolves in the pavilion were using their enhanced hearing to track her crunching footsteps. She hiked for an hour, pushing deep into the valley where the snow drifts were lighter and the underbrush thicker. She wasn't looking for an elk or a bear. Trying to take down massive prey with a spear was suicide. She needed something she could outsmart. She found a narrow game trail crisscrossing a frozen stream. The snow was churned up, littered with the distinctive cloven hoofprints of wild boar. The Boar's Head Tavern wasn't just a clever name. Maeve had processed enough of the aggressive, foul-tempered beasts to know their habits. They were territorial, stubborn, and entirely driven by their stomachs. Maeve set to work. She found a thick, sturdy oak sapling near the trail, and used the wire to fashion a heavy snare, burying the loop under a light dusting of snow. It was a dirty poacher's trick, the kind that would get a man hanged in the king's forest, but this wasn't a noble hunt. This was survival. Next, she took the pouch of cellar herbs. The mixture of dried wolfsbane, crushed garlic, and stale beer yeast smelled abhorrent. She rubbed it furiously over her boots, her cloak, and her hands. It wouldn't mask her scent completely, but it would confuse a boar's sensitive snout, making her smell less like a human and more like toxic, rotting foliage. Then she climbed. It took 10 agonizing minutes to pull herself up into the branches of a large pine overlooking the snare. The cold seeped through her gloves, her fingers going numb against the rough bark, and she waited. The forest was dead silent, save for the occasional crack of a freezing branch. 2 hours passed. Her toes lost feeling. Her teeth chattered so violently she had to bite down on the sleeve of her coat to muffle the sound. Doubt crept in. "They set you up to fail," a voice in her head whispered. "Reginald knows you'll freeze out here. Kaelin is sitting by a fire while you freeze." A sharp snap of wood broke her spiral. Below her, 50 yards down the trail, a massive shape pushed through the frost-heavy ferns. It was a boar, easily 300 pounds of bristling black muscle and yellowed tusks. It snorted its breath, pluming in the freezing air, rooting around in the snow for frozen acorns. Maeve held her breath. She gripped the spear. The boar ambled forward, following the trail exactly as she had predicted. It paused near the oak sapling, sniffing the ground where she had buried the snare. It snorted again, shaking its massive head, seemingly put off by the faint smell of the cellar herbs on the surrounding snow. "Take the step," Maeve prayed. "Just one more step." The boar stepped forward. The wire snapped taut. The snare caught its front right leg. The oak sapling, bent under immense tension, whipped upward. The boar didn't fly into the air, it was too heavy for that, but it was jerked violently off balance, its leg hoisted awkwardly off the ground. The beast screamed. It was a terrifying demonic sound. It thrashed wildly its tusks, gouging the earth, trying to tear its leg free from the wire that was now biting deep into its flesh. Maeve didn't hesitate. She dropped from the pine tree, hitting the snow hard, rolling to absorb the impact. She scrambled to her feet, bringing the spear up. The boar saw her. Its small, furious eyes locked onto her. It lunged, snapping the oak sapling with a sickening crack, but the wire held tangling around the roots of a nearby bush, tethering the beast to a 3-foot radius. Maeve stepped into that radius. The boar swung its head a tusk, grazing her heavy leather boot, slicing through the outer layer. She ignored the jolt of terror, braced the butt of the spear against the frozen earth, and thrust upward behind the boar's front shoulder, aiming for the heart. The impact jarred her teeth. The boar thrashed, screaming, the massive weight of it pushing against the spear shaft, threatening to snap the wood and crush her. Maeve held on, digging her boots into the snow, screaming back at the beast, throwing every ounce of her tavern-brawling strength into holding the line. Slowly, the boar's thrashing weakened. Its legs gave out. It collapsed into the blood-stained snow with a final rattling breath. Maeve fell backward, gasping for air, her chest heaving. Her hands were shaking violently. She looked at the massive carcass. It was bigger than her. She tied a rope around its hind legs. It took her 3 hours to drag it back to the pavilion. Every muscle in her back screamed. Her hands were blistered beneath her gloves. When she finally broke through the tree line, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and gold. The pavilion was silent. Maeve hauled the boar the last 20 yards, leaving a thick trench in the snow. She dropped the rope at the base of the wooden steps leading up to the elders. She looked up. Lord Reginald stared at the boar, his face an unreadable mask of fury. Lord Cedric was blinking rapidly. Kaelin stood up. He didn't look at the kill. He looked at Maeve. He saw the sliced leather of her boot, the exhaustion making her tremble, the absolute defiance burning in her eyes. "The hearth is provided for—" Kaelin announced, his voice ringing out over the quiet snowfield. He looked directly at Elder Bran, the oldest of the council. "Is the trial met?" Bran leaned forward, his milky eyes inspecting the massive beast, then shifting to the exhausted human woman who had brought it down alone. "The trial is met?" Bran rasped. "The Alpha's mate has proven her grit. Maeve didn't wait for applause. She spat a mouthful of metallic-tasting saliva into the snow and started the long walk back to the castle. She had earned her 5 years of no taxes, every damn penny of it. The fire in Kaelin's private study roared, throwing frantic shadows against the tapestries. The room smelled of old paper leather and wood smoke. Maeve sat in a heavy armchair near the hearth, staring blankly at the flames. She had bathed scrubbing the smell of boar blood pine pitch and fear from her skin until it was raw. She wore a simple linen tunic and soft woolen trousers, a gift from the castle staff, who were suddenly treating her with a terrified sort of reverence. The heavy oak door opened. Kaelin walked in. He carried a small wooden box and a goblet of dark wine. He shut the door behind him and locked it. The heavy clack of the iron bolt sounded definitive, sealing them in. He walked over and handed her the goblet. "Drink. It'll help the cold in your bones." Maeve took it. Her hands were still slightly unsteady. She took a long swallow. The wine was rich, heavily spiced with clove and cinnamon, and it burned a pleasant path down her throat. "Thank you." Kaelin pulled up a low stool and sat in front of her. He opened the wooden box. Inside were small jars of salve bandages and a basin of clean water. "Give me your foot," he said quietly. Maeve frowned, pulling her legs back toward the chair. "I'm fine. The tusk just grazed the boot. I don't have a scratch." "You've been limping since you walked out of the tree line. Give me your foot, Maeve. That isn't a request." His tone wasn't commanding, just incredibly weary. Reluctantly, she extended her right leg. Kaelin took her heel in his large hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He rolled up the hem of her woolen trousers and peeled back her thick sock. Her ankle was a mess of angry purple and black bruising, swollen to twice its normal size. She hadn't been cut, but the sheer force of the boar, throwing its weight against her leg during the struggle, had severely sprained the joint. The adrenaline had masked the pain during the walk back, but now it throbbed with a sickening rhythm. Kaelin stared at the bruise. His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping beneath his skin. He dipped a clean cloth into the water and began to wipe away a smear of dirt she had missed. "You could have died out there," he said, his voice low and tight. "If that wire had snapped, if you had missed the heart, but I didn't," Maeve said, leaning her head back against the chair. "I run a tavern in the lower ward, Kaelin. Do you know how many drunken mercenaries I've had to throw out the door? A boar is just a mercenary that doesn't talk back." Kaelin didn't smile. He opened a jar of pale green salve. It smelled sharply of mint and eucalyptus. He scooped out a small amount and began to massage it into her swollen ankle. Maeve hissed her fingers, gripping the arms of the chair. "Sorry," he murmured, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles over the bruised flesh. "This will draw out the inflammation. It's wolf medicine, but it works on humans just the same." His hands were incredibly warm. The heat seeped into her aching joint, soothing the sharpest edges of the pain. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and thick, but it lacked the tense, performative quality of their time in the market. It was just two exhausted people hiding from the world. "I underestimated you," Kaelin said suddenly. He didn't look up from her ankle. "When I made this deal, I thought I was buying a prop, a shield. I didn't realize I was throwing you to the wolves, literally. You were desperate," Maeve said, staring at the top of his dark head. "Kings do desperate things to keep their crowns. I don't care about the crown," Kaelin said bitterly. He finally looked up. The firelight caught in his grey eyes, turning them liquid. "I care about the pack. Reginald wants war with the Southern Territories to expand our borders. Cedric wants to bleed the lower wards dry with taxes to build a bigger army. If either of them gets control of me through a mating tie, thousands of people die. That's why I need time." He sounded so tired. The invincible Alpha King, the terrifying monster of the North, was just a man buckling under the weight of an entire territory. Without thinking, Maeve reached out. She traced her fingers lightly over the deep lines of exhaustion bracketing his mouth. Kaelin went entirely still. He stopped rubbing her ankle. His breath hitched in his chest, his eyes locking onto hers. The grey of his irises darkened rapidly, the black of his pupils expanding until it nearly swallowed the colour. The air in the study shifted. It became heavy-charged like the moment right before a thunderstorm breaks. "Maeve!" He whispered a rough, gravelly sound that vibrated deep in his chest. He leaned into her touch, turning his face slightly to press a kiss into the palm of her hand. The softness of his lips against her calloused skin sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight through her heart. It wasn't a performance. The door was locked. The elders weren't watching. He shifted his weight on the stool, leaning forward, closing the distance between them. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs, deafening in her own ears. She didn't pull away. She realized with a terrifying jolt of clarity that she didn't want to pull away. A sharp, frantic pounding on the heavy oak door shattered the quiet. Kaelan snapped back, blinking rapidly as if waking from a trance. The darkness in his eyes receded, replaced immediately by the cold, guarded look of a king. "My lord!" a voice yelled from the corridor. It was the captain of the guard. "My lord, forgive the intrusion." Kaelan stood up, moving away from Maeve. He dragged a hand down his face, reassembling his armor. "What is it, Captain?" he called out. "It's the lower ward, sire!" The captain shouted through the thick wood. "There's a fire. The Boar's Head Tavern is burning." Maeve's blood ran cold. The goblet slipped from her hands, shattering on the stone floor, dark wine pooling like blood in the firelight. They didn't take a carriage. Carriages were too slow for the narrow, winding streets of the lower ward. Kaelan threw a heavy wool cloak over Maeve's shoulders, hoisted her onto the back of his personal mount, a massive iron-grey gelding, and swung up behind her. They rode hard. The biting winter wind whipped Maeve's hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but she couldn't look away from the sky. Above the jagged rooftops of the city, a thick, greasy plume of black smoke blotted out the stars. The underbelly of the cloud glowed a malignant, bruised orange. It was a big fire. The smell hit them 3 blocks away. It wasn't the clean, sharp scent of a hearth fire. It was the acrid, choking stench of burning pitch, ancient rot, and incinerated livelihoods. Kaelan reined the horse in hard at the edge of the market square. The gelding stamped its hooves, tossing its head, spooked by the heat and the noise. Maeve slid off the horse before it fully stopped. Her sprained ankle screamed in protest as her boots hit the cobblestones, but the adrenaline drowned it out. She pushed through the panicked crowd of onlookers, ignoring the city guards yelling for people to stand back. The Boar's Head was gone. The heavy oak doors she had locked just that morning were charred splinters. The roof had already caved in, sending a geyser of sparks spiraling into the winter night. The second floor, her room, her bed, her meager savings hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a hollow, raging inferno. Maeve stopped. The heat radiated in aggressive waves, blistering her cold skin. The tavern wasn't just a building, it was her independence. It was the only thing standing between her and the streets, bought with years of aching joints, split knuckles, and sheer stubborn grit. "Beatrice!" Maeve screamed, her voice cracking. "I'm here, Maeve, I'm here." A figure pushed through the soot-stained crowd. It was Beatrice. Her apron was completely blackened, her hair singed on one side, but she was whole. She collided with Maeve, wrapping her in a tight, trembling hug. "I got out!" Beatrice sobbed, coughing violently into Maeve's shoulder. "I smelled the smoke before it reached the stairs. I tried to grab the strongbox, Maeve, I swear I did, but the floor in the tap room was already gone." "It's fine," Maeve said, her voice entirely numb. She stared over Beatrice's shoulder at the collapsing structure. The main support beam gave way with a deafening groan, sending a fresh wave of heat over the crowd. "You're safe. The coin doesn't matter." "It wasn't an accident," Beatrice whispered, pulling back. Her eyes were wide white, cutting through the soot on her face. "I saw them, Maeve, out the back window. 2 men in dark cloaks. They were throwing clay pots of lamp oil against the baseboards. They locked the back door from the outside." Maeve's blood turned to ice. They hadn't just tried to burn her business. They had tried to burn her alive. They didn't know she was at the keep. Heavy boots crunched on the ash-covered cobblestones behind her. Kaelin stepped to her side. He didn't look at the fire. He looked at the wreckage of Maeve's life, and then he looked at Beatrice. "Did you catch a scent?" Kaelin asked. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was a terrifying hollow sound. Beatrice swallowed hard, shrinking back slightly from the alpha. "Pine," she stammered. "Pine and old leather, like the guards up in the western grazing lands. Lord Cedric's territory, Reginald's closest ally." Kaelin didn't yell. He didn't curse. He turned his head slowly, looking back toward the high keep looming over the city on the hill. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his jaw. His eyes were no longer grey. They were absolute pitch black. The wolf was entirely at the surface. "Captain," Kaelin said softly. The captain of the guard stepped forward instantly. "Sire, seal the city gates. Nobody leaves. Pull every man from the barracks and have them march on the western guest wing of the castle." The captain hesitated. "Sire, Lord Cedric's personal guard is housed there. It will be seen as an act of hostility." "It is an act of war." Kaelin corrected his voice, a low, vibrating growl that made the nearby crowd fall dead silent. The crackle of the burning tavern was the only sound left. "They attacked my mate, in my city. Arrest them all. If they resist, kill them." "Kaelin," Maeve said, reaching out to grab his arm. The muscle beneath the thick wool of his tunic was rigid as stone. "You don't have proof. If you slaughter Cedric's men, the council will turn on you." He looked down at her. The lethal, cold fury in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second when he met her gaze. He reached out his soot-stained hand, gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed a streak of ash from her cheekbone. "They burned your home," Kaelin said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper meant only for her. "They tried to burn you. The game is over, Maeve. I am done playing politics with men who use fire in the dark." He turned back to the captain. "Move." The great hall was freezing. The hearth fires hadn't been lit, and the pre-dawn chill clung to the stone walls. Maeve sat in the high chair at the head of the table. She hadn't washed. She still smelled of smoke and ash. Her ruined boots rested on a velvet footstool Kaelin had aggressively ordered a servant to bring. The heavy doors banged open. Lord Reginald and Lord Cedric marched in. They were flanked by the captain of the guard and a dozen armed royal soldiers. Reginald looked furious. Cedric looked pale. "What is the meaning of this?" Reginald bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Your guards dragged us from our beds. Cedric's men have been locked in the armory like common criminals." Kaelin stood at the head of the table just behind Maeve's chair. He hadn't changed clothes either. He looked exactly like what he was, a warlord who had just spent the night breathing in the ashes of an attack on his territory. "Bring him in," Kaelin ordered. 2 royal guards dragged a man into the hall. He was bleeding from a broken nose, his clothes torn. He was thrown to the stone floor at Reginald's feet. Maeve leaned forward. It was one of the mercenaries she had seen drinking in the upper ward 2 days ago. He was caught trying to climb the southern wall. Kaelin said, his voice unnervingly calm. He smelled heavily of lamp oil. Under brief questioning, he confessed to throwing the pots against the boar's head. "A common thug," Reginald sneered, refusing to look at the man on the floor. "The lower ward is full of them. What does this have to do with us?" He also confessed to who paid him. Kaelin continued. He walked slowly around the table, his boots echoing sharply. He said a man smelling of pine and old leather handed him a pouch of silver. A man wearing the crest of the western grazing lands. Cedric flinched. Reginald stood taller, puffing out his chest. "Hearsay," Reginald barked. "The word of a paid cutthroat. You have no proof, Kaelin. This is a desperate attempt to frame us, because you know your grip on the council is slipping. You parade this human around pretending she is your mate, insulting our traditions." Kaelin stopped inches from Reginald. The size difference was suddenly glaring. Kaelin towered over the older lord. The air in the hall grew incredibly heavy, pressing down on everyone's lungs. It was the oppressive physical weight of an alpha's pure dominance. "Insulting traditions," Kaelin repeated softly. He didn't blink. You demanded a trial of the hearth. She passed it. You demanded a public courtship. We provided it. But you couldn't beat her in the light, Reginald, so you tried to burn her in the dark. It is a fake bond. Reginald shouted, pushing back against the aura, his own eyes flashing gold. She has no wolf. She gives off no scent. She is a tavern whore you bought to stall the council. The silence that followed was absolute. Maeve gripped the armrests of her chair, bracing for Kaelin to lose his temper. She expected him to draw a sword. She expected him to tear Reginald's throat out right there on the ancient stone floor. He didn't do either. Instead, Kaelin turned his back on Reginald. He walked back to the head of the table and stopped in front of Maeve. He knelt. A collective gasp echoed from the guards. Kings did not kneel, not to anyone. Kaelin ignored them. He looked up at Maeve. His eyes were back to their stormy grey, completely clear, completely focused on her. The mask of the calculating politician was gone. The exhausted monarch was gone. He's right, Kaelin said. His voice carried effortlessly through the quiet hall. It started as a fake bond, a transaction. I needed a shield. I offered to pay your taxes in exchange for a lie. Maeve's breath hitched. She looked at the council lords who were suddenly staring in stunned silence. He was admitting it. He was throwing the game. Kaelin, don't! Maeve whispered fiercely. He took her soot-stained hands in his. His grip was warm, anchoring her. But it ceased being a lie, the moment you walked into this hall. Kaelin continued, his voice steady. It ceased being a lie when you bled in the snow for a pack that didn't want you. It ceased being a lie tonight when I looked at the fire and realized that if you had been inside, I would have burned this entire kingdom down to keep you warm. He wasn't acting. Maeve saw it in the tension of his shoulders, felt it in the slight tremor of his hands holding hers. The air shifted again, but this time it wasn't heavy with dominance. It was thick with a scent so powerful it made Maeve's head spin. Rain-soaked pine, cold iron, and something else. Something deep, primal, and entirely possessive. It was Kaelin's scent, but it was wrapping around her, soaking into her skin, binding them together in a way that defied genetics and logic. The pack magic, ancient and volatile, was recognizing a truth stronger than bloodlines. Kaelin stood up, keeping one of her hands firmly in his. He turned back to the lords. I claim her, Kaelin declared. The words weren't a political statement. They were a vow etched into the stone of the room. Not by a trial, not by council approval. I claim Maeve of the Lower Ward as my true mate, and the Luna of this pack. If any man in this room wishes to dispute my claim, let him step forward and challenge me for the crown right now. He let go of Maeve's hand and stepped into the center of the hall, his arms loose at his sides, completely open. A direct physical challenge. Reginald stared at Kaelin. He looked at the massive shoulders, the dark, lethal eyes, and the sheer, unadulterated power radiating off the Alpha King. Then Reginald looked at Cedric. Cedric slowly, deliberately dropped his gaze to the floor and took a step backward, abandoning the alliance. Reginald's face flushed purple. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had gambled on Kaelin being weak on Kaelin, hiding behind politics. Faced with the raw, brutal reality of the Alpha, Reginald folded. He bowed his head, staring bitterly at the stone floor. Take Lord Reginald to the dungeons. Kaelin ordered the captain, his voice cracking like a whip. He will face a tribunal for the attempted murder of the Luna. Lord Cedric, you will confine yourself to your quarters until I decide what to do with you. The guards moved instantly. There was no hesitation. The chain of command had been absolutely violently re-established. As Reginald was dragged away, cursing under his breath, Kaelin turned back to Maeve. The fierce warlord faded, leaving only a man who looked like he had, finally after a very long time, found his way home. Spring came late to Oak Hill, but when it finally broke, it broke with a vengeance. The snowmelt turned the Lower Ward into a muddy swamp for a month, but by May the cobblestones were dry, and the air smelled of green shoots and wet earth. Maeve stood in the center of a newly framed building. The roof wasn't on yet, just fresh, pale pine beams crisscrossing against the bright blue sky. It smelled of sawdust and resin. It was going to be beautiful, much bigger than the old place. The tap room was twice the size, with a massive stone hearth that drew perfectly. There was even a proper cellar that wouldn't flood every time it rained. The carpenters say they'll have the slate on by Tuesday. A familiar, gravelly voice said behind her. Maeve turned. Kaelan was navigating the muddy perimeter, stepping over a stack of lumber. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and dirt on his boots. He looked relaxed. The permanent furrow between his brows had smoothed out significantly over the last 3 months. They said that last Tuesday. Maeve pointed out, leaning against the unfinished bar. She still wore her practical rough-spun tunics, though the fabrics were of noticeably better quality now. I can threaten them with the dungeons if it would make you feel better. Kaelan offered, stepping up beside her and resting his elbows on the smooth wood. Don't you dare. Arthur the baker is already terrified enough when I come down to buy pies. If you start locking up my builders, I'll have to start brewing the ale in the castle kitchens. Kaelan grimaced. Please don't. The cook still hasn't forgiven you for showing her how to properly butcher a pig. Maeve laughed. The sound was easy, unburdened. It was a stark contrast to the heavy, cynical woman who had wiped down a sticky bar in November. The trial of Lord Reginald had been swift. Stripped of his lands and titles, he was exiled to the frozen wastelands beyond the border. Cedric, terrified by the display of power, had sworn absolute unbreakable fealty to the crown, completely dissolving the council's rebellion. But the biggest change wasn't political. It was the pack. They hadn't questioned Kaelan's claim. The scent that had bloomed in the great hall that morning had settled over Maeve like a second skin. To the wolves of Oak Hill, she was no longer a human tavern keeper. She was the Alpha's chosen. They brought her disputes to settle. They lowered their heads when she passed, and much to her eternal annoyance, they refused to let her carry her own groceries. You don't have to rebuild it, you know. Kaelan said quietly, looking around the empty framework. You are the Luna. You have the entire royal treasury at your disposal. You don't ever have to pour another ale. Maeve looked at the fresh wood. She thought about the sticky floors, the late-night brawls, and the sheer exhaustion of her old life. She didn't miss the struggle, but she missed the space that was entirely hers. I know I don't have to, Maeve said, turning her head to look at him. But I want to. The castle is yours, Kaelan. Its politics and councils and ancient laws. This... She gestured to the wooden beams. This is real. This is where people actually live. I need a foot in this world to keep me sane, and to keep me grounded. Kaelan murmured. Someone has to tell you when you're acting like an arrogant bastard. She agreed smoothly. Kaelan smiled. It was a full, genuine smile that still managed to catch her off guard. He reached out his hand, sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The warmth of his body seeped through her tunic. The familiar scent of pine and iron washed over her, grounding her instantly. You owe me, Maeve said, tipping her head back to look at him. The original deal was 5 years of waived taxes. Since you got my tavern burned down, I'm amending the terms. Are you... Kaelan raised an eyebrow, his hand tightening slightly on her waist. What are the new terms? A lifetime exemption. For me and Beatrice. And you have to pay for the new copper brewing vats. Extortion, Kaelan whispered, leaning down. His lips brushed the corner of her mouth. Absolute robbery. Take it or leave it, Your Grace. I'll take it, he murmured, before capturing her lips entirely. It wasn't a calculated touch for the elders. It wasn't a desperate grab for comfort in a dark study. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely real. The kiss tasted of the sweet spring air and the absolute certainty of a bargain well struck. When he finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, the chaotic noise of the lower ward, the shouts of merchants, the clatter of wagons faded into a pleasant hum. 1 fake date, Kalen whispered, his eyes crinkling at the corners. And look what you dragged me into. You asked for me. Maeve reminded him of fierce, protective warmth blooming in her chest. Next time be careful what you bargain for. And that's how one fake date turned the entire kingdom upside down. Maeve proved that you don't need sharp fangs to survive a pack of wolves. Sometimes all you need is a sharp mind, a heavy spear, and the courage to call an alpha's bluff. If you loved watching Maeve and Kalen go from reluctant business partners to the most powerful couple in Oak Hill, smash that like button, share this story with your friends who love a good fake dating romance. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic storytelling. See you in the next one.